You don't remember being born. No one does in this place. The land itself feels older than memory, a stretch of river and clay that's been rewriting its own story since time began. The sky is a dusty gray, heavy with the kind of silence that comes before something enormous, or after something that has already ended. Somewhere nearby, a scribe presses a wedge of reed into wet clay. You can almost hear the rhythm, tap, press, lift, the earliest heartbeat of written history. He's not writing poetry or prayers. He's listing names. Kings, apparently. Men who ruled before the flood. Men who supposedly lived longer than mountains. You lean closer. The tablet gleams faintly, a raw piece of baked earth carrying numbers that don't make sense. 241,200 years, it says. 8 kings. 5 cities. Nearly 250,000 years of unbroken rule. You blink, wondering if someone added too many zeros. But no, each name, each city, each impossible reign is carved with conviction. Al-Yalim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alaugar, 36,000 years. Enmenluana, 43,200 years. You can almost hear the narrator in your head whisper, and it only gets worse. These kings lived before the Great Flood, the scribe insists, a time when kingship descended from heaven. Not metaphorically, literally, as if heaven dropped it off one morning and said, "Good luck, try not to drown." You imagine standing in Eridu, the first city, or so the story goes. The river smells like salt and silt, the air thick with the heat of a civilization that barely exists yet. You don't have a calendar, a clock, or even a clear sense of how long a year should be. But somewhere, someone decided to count, and they counted big. 241,200 years big. The Sumerians were practical people. They invented the wheel, irrigation, even beer, but this was something else. This was myth disguised as math. Or maybe math disguised as myth. The scribe's clay tablet reads like a cosmic ledger. It doesn't say why the kings lived that long, only that they did. As if time itself moved differently back then. Maybe a year wasn't what we think it was. Maybe a sar, the Sumerian unit of 3,600 years, meant something symbolic. Maybe these numbers were the language of gods, not accountants. Or maybe, and this is the unsettling part, maybe they believed it. You look again at the list. It's neat. Ordered. Almost bureaucratic. Kingship was in Eridu. Then it fell to Bad Tibur. Then to Larag, then to Zimbir, then to Shurapak. Like an ancient version of musical chairs, except every player lives 30,000 years and the floor is covered in mud. When the scribe finally finishes, he adds one simple line beneath the last king. Then the flood swept over. And just like that, the world ends. It's a strange way to start history, with the destruction of everything. But that's how the Sumerians saw it. Civilization rises, drowns, and begins again. A pattern as old as myth. You stare at the clay tablet, the faint imprint of fingers long turned to dust. You realize you're looking at one of humanity's oldest attempts to make sense of time, not with stars or stones, but with stories. The kings before the flood ruled impossibly long, but perhaps that was the point. Maybe the numbers weren't meant to convince. Maybe they were meant to remind that before our history, there was something else. Something larger, stranger, and mercifully out of reach. And you, sitting here, thousands of years later, are still trying to read it. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Because tonight, you're going back to the beginning, to the world before the flood. And we're going to find out what those 241,200 years were really about. You run your hand over the clay tablet, not that it matters. The kings it lists are long gone, and so are the scribes who wrote their names. But the thing about clay is that it doesn't care about mortality. It just hardens and waits. Thousands of years later, it's still waiting, in fragments scattered across museums, each one whispering a story about power, time, and maybe a touch of delusion. They call it the Sumerian King List now. But to the people who made it, it wasn't a list. It was truth. Authority carved into the bones of the earth. Each wedge-shaped mark wasn't just writing, it was a spell of legitimacy. It begins like this. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Simple. declarative, terrifyingly confident. The tablet then goes on calmly, methodically, to list 8 kings who ruled before the Great Flood. Alyalim of Eridu, Alaulgar of Eridu, Enmanluana of Bad Tibur, Enmangalana of Bad Tibur, Dumuzi the shepherd, yes, that Dumuzi, lover of Inanna, part-time god, full-time tragic myth. Then, Ensipedzadana of Larag, Enmendur-Anna of Zimbir, and finally, Uber-Tutu of Shuruppak. 8 kings, 5 cities, and then, nothing but water. According to the list, these 8 ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. If you're trying to picture that, don't. You can't. That's older than agriculture, writing, and possibly the concept of having a bad day. To put it in perspective, if each of those kings lived their entire reign as an unbroken human life, one of them would have seen the last ice age end, watched continents flood, and then probably died of sheer boredom. But of course, they didn't. At least, not in the way we think. The king list wasn't meant to be a diary of actual events. It was a record of order, of where divine rule was supposed to reside. The gods, apparently, didn't just hand out crowns at random. They passed them along from city to city, like a celestial relay race. Eridu, then Bad Tibur, then Larag, then Zimbir, then Shuruppak. Each one rises, shines, and eventually drowns. And after the flood? The pattern continues. Kingship descends again. But now, reign lengths shrink from tens of thousands of years to mere hundreds, then to dozens. By the time you reach the later sections of the list, rulers are governing for 20, 10, even 6 years. You can almost hear the ancient scribes sighing, well, the glory days are over. But the shift matters. It's as if time itself compresses, divine eternity collapses into mortal chronology. The Sumerians didn't just record history, they dramatized it. They turned cosmic ages into dynastic footnotes. The king list gives us both myth and measurement, sacred pattern and mundane administration. And that's what makes it so unsettling. Because it doesn't sound like fantasy. It sounds official. Boring even. Which somehow makes it worse. Each king's reign is described with bureaucratic precision, not many years, or a long time, but exact numbers. 28,800 years. 36,000, 43,200. 28,800 again. These weren't random exaggerations. They were part of a system, a numerical language built on 60s on SARS, 3,600 years, and NS, 600 years. Someone sat down, did the math, and thought, yes, that seems reasonable. And maybe it did. To them, time wasn't linear. It was divine, cyclical, elastic. The past wasn't gone. It was layered, like sediment. So when they said a king ruled 43,200 years, maybe they weren't describing a lifespan. Maybe they were describing an age, a cosmic season of stability before everything went under. Still, the modern mind rebels. We crave footnotes, carbon dating, something empirical. Instead, we get a list that claims humans ruled the world longer than the existence of civilization itself. And yet, here it is. Real clay. Real writing. Real belief. You stare at the tablet, and it stares back, unbothered by your skepticism. For the Sumerians, kingship wasn't political, it was theological. The right to rule came from heaven, not birth or conquest. And when heaven got tired of one city, it simply moved on. The king list, then, isn't history. It's theology written like a spreadsheet. But as we'll soon see, the moment water enters the story, when the flood sweeps over, the numbers collapse, and the world we recognize finally begins. Congrats! You've survived 241,200 years of divine management. Now comes the flood. You stand at the edge of a slow, brown river, the Euphrates, maybe. Or the Tigris. Or both, before they learn to separate properly. The ground beneath you squishes like wet bread. In the distance, a cluster of reed huts crouches against the horizon. Eridu, the first city. The air tastes of salt, clay, and the kind of humidity that feels personal. This is where it all begins. They said kingship descended from heaven here, as if the gods themselves dropped it like a misplaced artifact. You look around, expecting a throne, maybe a divine light beam. Instead, you get mud, mosquitoes, and a few exhausted farmers trying to coax barley out of the riverbank. And yet, this is Eridu, cradle of civilization, home of Al-Yalim, the first king. According to the list, Al-Yalim ruled for 28,800 years. Long enough to see the city built, flooded, rebuilt, and possibly relocated several times without ever needing a nap. You try to imagine what 28,800 years feels like. A few decades, maybe if you're patient. A few centuries if you're divine. But nearly 30,000? Even if Al-Yalim started as a child, he would have outlived empires that hadn't been invented yet. And then came Alaugar, also of Eridu. His reign lasted 36,000 years. Because apparently, longevity was contagious back then. When Eridu's light finally dimmed, which must have taken geological effort, kingship descended again, this time to Bad Tibra, the city of smiths, where the sound of hammers rang out across the plains. You can almost hear it, the first metal striking metal, echoing through a pre-flood dawn. There, 2 kings reigned, Enmenlu-Anna and Enmengal-Anna. Their combined rule lasted nearly 80,000 years. You might think that would be enough to perfect metallurgy, but considering how often Mesopotamian roofs collapsed, apparently not. Next, kingship moved to Larak. The name sounds small now, but in the king list, it gleams briefly like a forgotten star. 1 king ruled there, Enspizadana, 28,800 years again. The Sumerians loved a good repeating pattern. Then came Zimbir, later known as Sippar, a city associated with the sun god, Utu. Its ruler, Enmendur-Anna, reigned for 21,000 years. Legend says Utu loved him so much, he took Enmendur-Anna up to heaven and taught him the secrets of divination. You might recognize the story's distant echo. Later traditions turned him into Enoch, or even Hermes Trismegistus. Apparently, heaven had a recurring internship program for particularly ambitious monarchs. Finally, kingship settled in Shuruppak, under Ubirtutu. A nice enough man, if you ignored the fact that his city was about to be erased. His reign lasted 18,600 years, modest compared to the others. He was also the father of Zisadra, the Sumerian Noah. And that should tell you what happens next. When Ubirtutu ruled, the king list says, the flood swept over. No fanfare. No thunder. Just a flat line of text. Centuries of rule vanish under a single sentence. You can almost feel it coming. The air growing heavy, the waterline rising, the anxious glances between temple priests. They must have known something was wrong. You'd like to think someone tried to warn them. That Zisadra, perhaps, was already building something big and wooden upstream. But no one listens to prophets until it rains. So, you stand there, in the mud of Shuruppak, surrounded by the ghosts of 241,200 years of rule. You can hear the first drops of rain hitting clay rooftops. Someone, somewhere, is still carving names into wet tablets, even as the tablets themselves begin to dissolve. And that's the tragedy and the genius of the Sumerian King List. It builds a world so impossibly ancient that its destruction feels inevitable. You glance at the final line again. Then the flood swept over. No description, no survivors, no desperate cries for the gods' attention. Just the quiet, bureaucratic end of everything. The pre-flood kings vanish, their centuries folded into myth. But after the waters recede, something changes. The world shrinks, the numbers fall, and kings become human again, or at least closer to it. For now, though, all you can do is watch the sky darken. Because when the flood comes, it takes more than cities. It washes away the idea that anyone, or anything, could rule forever. You don't see it at first. The flood. It begins the way most disasters do, quietly. The rain is just rain until it isn't. The Sumerians didn't describe the apocalypse with thunder and screaming skies. They wrote it as a transition. One line. Then the flood swept over. That's it. No adjectives. No drama. Just a blunt administrative note on the end of the world. But if you close your eyes, you can fill in the rest. The rivers rise, slowly at first, then all at once. The ground gives way to silt and water. Whole cities, Eridu, Bad Tibra, Larak, disappear beneath the tide like names erased from a clay tablet. You can hear it, the wind, the rush of water, the crack of reed huts breaking apart. Somewhere far away, priests scream the names of gods who are no longer listening. And in the middle of it all, maybe, just maybe, one man survives. His name is Sayusadra, son of Ubertutu of Shuruppak. The story says he was warned by one of the gods, perhaps Enki, the same god who always seemed to disobey the counsel of the divine when humans were involved. Sayusadra builds a great boat, loads it with life, and waits. The flood comes. The boat rises. Everything else sinks. It's familiar, isn't it? Different name, same story. Later cultures would call him Utnapishtim or Noah. Different languages, same collective trauma. When the waters finally recede, the land is new again, or maybe just emptier. The King List resumes with another dry line. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. And just like that, history restarts. You can almost hear the Sumerians shrug. The flood wasn't the end of civilization, only the reset button. All the divine kings are gone now. Their reigns, their impossible centuries, their God-breathed legitimacy. What's left is humanity. Fragile, mortal, nervous. Kish is the first post-flood city, and its kings are very different. No one rules for 36,000 years anymore. The longest reigns now last a few hundred, the shortest only decades. For the first time, the numbers begin to make sense, or at least sound like numbers that could fit inside a human life. This is where myth begins to dissolve into history. Archaeologists have actually found Kish, or what's left of it, and they've found names that appear in both legend and dirt. Etna of Kish, for example, who was said to have ascended to heaven on the back of an eagle in search of the plant of birth. Whether or not he found it, his name is carved into clay. He existed in some form. That's the strange part. The Sumerian King List starts as pure myth, then slowly slides into verifiable archaeology. It's as if someone merged a theology textbook with a census. You can imagine the scribe sitting there, centuries later, piecing together the ruins of time. He knows the flood happened, or at least something like it. He knows cities rose again, kings reigned, wars were fought. But he also knows that before all this, before Kish and Uruk and Ur, there was something larger. Something divine. So he writes it all down. One tablet after another. Kings before the flood, kings after. Names, dates, durations. Every few lines he notes when kingship moved, from Kish to Uruk, to Ur, to On. The crown drifts from city to city like a reluctant ghost. And the tone never changes. The same calm, measured rhythm, whether it's describing an immortal king ruling for 43,200 years or a mortal one ruling for 7. The universe may have drowned, but the paperwork must go on. You can't help but admire the audacity of it. Imagine living through a flood that wipes away the world, and the first thing your descendants do is start counting again. Writing again. Naming kings again. It's almost funny, in a bleak, deeply human way. The flood isn't just destruction. It's a recalibration. A way of saying, let's start over, but this time, let's keep track. And so they did. The pre-flood era became myth, the post-flood era became memory, and between them stands a thin, muddy line, the divide between what we imagine and what we can prove. You can almost picture the last scribe of Shuruppak watching the flood fade into horizon mist, wondering if anyone would ever remember what came before. They did, but only as numbers too large to believe. You're sitting beside a clay tablet again. This time, it isn't wet and glistening. It's old, cracked, dust-colored, a survivor. A small, rectangular memory of a world that refused to stay mythical. The flood has come and gone, civilization has rebooted, and now, centuries later, a scribe sits in a cool temple room, stylus in hand. He's not writing a story. He's copying one. The Sumerian King List has already existed for generations. His job is to make another version, to preserve it, update it, maybe even fix a few numbers if they've drifted too far into nonsense. This is how it begins again. The list keeps evolving, clay by clay, dynasty by dynasty. And though every copy is slightly different, the message stays the same. Kingship descends from heaven, moves from city to city, and history follows behind it like a loyal dog. The scribes treat the list like sacred accounting. Each king's reign is carefully noted, measured in sars and nis, 3,600 years here, 600 years there, units that make no sense to you but feel deliberate to them. They're not exaggerating, they're encoding something. Or at least, that's what later scholars would hope. Because, of course, we eventually find the tablets. Thousands of years later, modern archaeologists dust them off, squint at the cuneiform, and try to make sense of the absurd arithmetic. 241,200 years. 8 kings. The pre-flood period. They start doing what humans do best, interpreting. Maybe, some argue, these reign lengths aren't literal. Maybe years, in ancient Sumer, didn't mean what we think it means. Maybe they were symbolic, cosmic, or even astronomical, each number representing a pattern of stars or a sacred calendar cycle. Others think the numbers might represent dynasties, not lifetimes. And then there's the simpler, less poetic idea. Maybe someone just miscopied a few zeros. But the Sumerians weren't sloppy. Their numbering system was sophisticated, base 60, clean and consistent. When they said 36,000, they meant 36,000. So what were they doing? Perhaps, some suggest, they weren't counting time at all. They were counting importance. Longevity as a metaphor for legitimacy. A ruler who lived for 43,200 years wasn't biologically impressive, he was cosmically sanctioned. His reign symbolized an age of divine order, a period so long it transcended human reckoning. You can see the logic. In a world where floods erase memory, exaggeration is survival. Make your kings immortal, and your civilization becomes eternal by proxy. Still, that doesn't stop the speculation. The moment modern readers see those numbers, the myth turns radioactive. People start whispering about lost civilizations, ancient aliens, and hidden timelines. The King List becomes fuel for every theory that wants humanity to be older, wiser, or weirder than archaeology allows. It's easy to see why. The story sounds like an origin myth disguised as a logbook. 8 divine kings ruling the world before a global flood? It's biblical déjà vu, except older. But here's where the scribes and scholars quietly disagree. The Sumerians didn't think they were making fantasy. They were mapping divine legitimacy, not human biology. To them, kingship descending from heaven wasn't a metaphor, it was a real, ongoing event. Power came from the gods. Rule was their gift. And when you write that belief down in numbers, it starts to look mathematical, even when it's not. The problem is, modern readers can't resist taking numbers literally. So we do the worst thing you can do to an ancient myth. We start fact-checking it. Was there a flood? Possibly. There's geological evidence for major floods in Mesopotamia around 2900 BC. Were there kings named Alyalim, Alaugr, and Ubra-Tutu? Maybe not. Or maybe their names were titles, mythic composites of real rulers. Did anyone rule for 36,000 years? Probably not. Unless they had really good skincare. Still, we keep circling the same mystery. Why 241,200 years? Why not 1,000 or 10,000? Why that number across multiple copies? Maybe because the scribes loved symmetry. Maybe because 241,200 divides neatly into 60, the sacred number of their entire cosmology. Or maybe because the past wasn't supposed to make sense. It was supposed to remind you that time itself had divine fingerprints. You can almost hear the ancient scribe laughing at your confusion. He wasn't writing history. He was writing theology with a calculator. And somewhere, buried in all that math and myth, is a warning that even the oldest civilizations couldn't resist making sense of chaos by giving it a pattern. Even if that pattern added up to something impossible. You'd like to think ancient people wrote things down for noble reasons, to remember, to teach, to preserve. But more often than not, they wrote to justify. The Sumerian King List isn't a bedtime story. It's an argument, carved in clay. An ancient press release, explaining who deserves to rule, and why everyone else should shut up about it. By the time it was written, kingship wasn't new. Cities had risen and fallen for centuries. Dynasties had shifted. But every new ruler faced the same awkward question. Why you? The King List answers that with divine flair. Because heaven said so. Kingship descended from heaven. It repeats like a mantra. Not was earned, not was voted in, but descended. The Sumerians didn't separate theology from politics. The gods were the HR department of kingship. You can almost picture it. A new ruler in Uruk or you are commissioning his scribes to update the records. A little editing here, a new name there. Maybe shorten the previous dynasty's achievements, stretch your own reign a bit. Who's counting? Well, technically everyone, but literacy was rare, so who could argue? The result? A beautifully organized illusion. A lineage of rulers stretching back to before the flood. A direct, unbroken inheritance from the gods. It's propaganda on a cosmic scale. To the average farmer or bricklayer, this mattered. If your king could trace his authority to Eridu, to the days when the world was new, then obeying him wasn't just politics, it was piety. Disobedience wasn't rebellion, it was blasphemy. It's genius, really. Wrap your government in myth, and suddenly the taxes sting less. The King List structure is part of the trick. Each entry reads like a ritual formula. After the kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. In Eridu, Al-Yalim became king and ruled for 28,800 years. Then Eridu fell, and the kingship passed to Bad Tibra. It's repetitive, hypnotic. The rhythm itself creates the illusion of order, as if the world runs on divine spreadsheets. Chaos might devour cities, floods might erase generations, but kingship continues. Always descending, always restored. The Sumerians needed that idea. They lived in a world that collapsed regularly. Crops failed. Rivers flooded or vanished. Enemies burned cities for sport. The King List told them it all fit into a cosmic plan. That destruction was just another stage in the divine cycle of succession. It's comforting in a grim sort of way. And deeply human. Because when you strip away the cuneiform and divine titles, the King List reads like every political document ever written. A story about legitimacy. About who gets to sit on the throne, and why everyone else's version of history is wrong. Modern scholars see it too. They've compared versions of the list found in different cities, each slightly different, each conveniently favoring its own dynasty. It's the ancient equivalent of alternative facts. Kish's version highlights Kish. Uruk's version emphasizes Uruk. It's almost adorable. But the genius of the King List lies in how well it hides its bias behind eternity. By setting the stage with myth, by starting before the flood, every later king inherits divine authority by association. The message is subtle but unmistakable. If those ancient kings ruled by heaven's command, so do we. You can almost hear the scribe's internal voice as he carves. This isn't just a list. This is law. And yet, beneath the reverence, there's something tragic. The list pretends to bring order, but what it really reveals is obsession, the desperate human need to make chaos make sense. To believe that floods, wars, famines, all of it, are part of a pattern. That power has rules. That history has a spine. But deep down, even the scribes must have known better. Every time they added a new king, they were admitting the same truth. The system always breaks, and someone always has to rebuild it. Still they wrote. They inscribed. They believed. Because if you could convince the world that kingship came from heaven, maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't drown again. You wake up again, not in Eridu, not among gods, but in dust and daylight. The flood has passed. The world is quieter now. And for the first time, the names on the King List start to sound human. Gone are the rulers of 43,000 years. Gone are the divine kings who never slept, never aged. What comes next are reigns you can almost imagine. 900 years, 120, 80, 56. Still impossible by modern standards, but now they have weight, shape, and mortality. This is where myth exhales and memory begins. The line on the tablet is blunt and simple. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. And there it is, the reboot. Civilization 2.0. Fresh mud, new kings, Same divine contract. Kish becomes the first post-flood city. Its king, Jushur, supposedly ruled for 1,200 years. You can practically hear the scribes trying to scale things down to a more reasonable level of exaggeration. 1,000 years? Sure, that sounds believable compared to 40,000. This is the moment the king list begins to drift into the realm of record rather than revelation. Some of these kings, Etna of Kish, Enmebaragesi, actually appear in other inscriptions, real archaeological finds, carved during their lifetimes. Their names are still wrapped in myth, but now, at least, they leave footprints. The shift feels almost deliberate. The tone of the list changes. The early sections read like a hymn. The later sections read like minutes from a very long, very dusty meeting. The gods are still in the margins, but humans are now the main characters. Flawed, mortal, and endlessly replaceable. And that's the real tragedy, isn't it? For all the talk of divine descent, once the flood ends, the magic starts leaking out. The further the list goes, the shorter the reigns become. From thousands of years to hundreds. From hundreds to decades. Until one day, kings rule for only a handful of years before being replaced, assassinated, forgotten. You can feel time accelerating. What once felt like eternity now feels like history. Fragile, temporary, full of noise. Maybe that's the real flood the king list wanted to describe. Not a deluge of water, but a flood of mortality. Congrats! You've officially entered the part of human history where people start keeping receipts. Clay tablets record harvests, debts, rations. Bureaucracy creeps in. Temples turn into offices. Priests become accountants with better hats. And through it all, the king list evolves, copied, updated, reinterpreted by scribes in city after city. Each time, it stretches the thread of kingship a little further into the present. A living myth, constantly rewritten to fit whoever happens to be sitting on the throne. You can almost picture a scribe in Uruk, 3 centuries after the flood, squinting at the old tablets. The divine king's numbers don't make sense anymore. The new rulers are mortal men who die on schedule. So the scribe adds the flood, a cosmic line break between divine time and human time. A way to explain the shift without admitting that the old stories were never literal. Because even then, people needed continuity. They couldn't bear the thought that the past was just stories, or that their civilization came from nowhere. The flood made it simple. Everything changed, but nothing really ended. And maybe that's why this section of the king list feels so melancholic. You can sense the tension between what was once believed and what can no longer be sustained. Between gods who ruled for millennia and kings who barely outlasted a harvest season. It's a strange inheritance, a civilization crawling out of myth, dripping with old divinity but now subject to taxes and death. The sacred becomes administrative. The eternal becomes recorded. And the clay tablets multiply endlessly. So here you are, standing in Kish at the edge of 2 worlds. Behind you, the shining ghosts of antediluvian kings. Ahead of you, the muddy, bustling birth of history. You can almost hear the scribes whispering as they work. Remember the flood. But don't forget the paperwork. You sit before the tablet. The clay is old, the cuneiform sharp. And staring back at you are numbers so absurd that your brain tries to blink them away. 28,800 years. 36,000 years. 43,200. Each line insists, this is how long he ruled. And each line lies beautifully. The total, 241,200 years, hangs like a cosmic joke. You can't even visualize that much time. Entire species could evolve and go extinct in that span. It's not a reign, it's a geological era with a name and a crown. But to the Sumerians, it wasn't nonsense. It was order, divine arithmetic. You see, the Sumerian number system wasn't based on tens like ours. It was based on 60s, a sexagesimal system. That's why we still divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. In their math, they had words for big units. N equals 600 years. Sar equals 3,600 years. Sas equals 60 years. So when they said a king ruled for 8 sars, that meant 28,800 years. It sounds mad to you, but to them, it was precise, ritualistic, symbolic. And maybe that's the trick. These weren't years in the way we think of years. They might have represented cycles, generations, or cosmic periods, ages of the gods, not birthdays of men. Still, it's hard not to picture it literally. A king sitting on his throne for 36,000 years, growing steadily more tired, wondering if his retirement benefits include immortality. Spoiler alert, they don't. Historians have wrestled with these numbers for centuries. Some think scribes miscopied older texts, adding or losing zeros like drunken accountants. Others argue the numbers were never meant to measure time at all. They were status markers, mathematical halos meant to exaggerate divine authority. Because if your god-kings ruled for 43,200 years, it doesn't just make them powerful, it makes them cosmic. Their reigns become the orbit of stars, the rhythm of the universe itself. You can imagine a priest standing before a crowd, pointing to the heavens. As long as the constellations move, so does the king's power endure. It's not about time, it's about scale. And yet, some modern writers still take the list literally. They look at the numbers and whisper about lost technology, vanished civilizations, or even extraterrestrial rulers. After all, how else could someone reign for 40 millennia? The answer, unfortunately, is much simpler. Humans have always lied beautifully, especially about their leaders. You can trace this impulse through time. Pharaohs lived for millions of years. Chinese emperors were sons of heaven. Medieval kings claimed divine right by bloodline. Same story, different clay. And in each case, the exaggeration serves the same function, to bridge the gap between mortal rule and divine authority. Because if your ruler can be measured in human years, he can be replaced. But if his reign is measured in cosmic cycles, then rebellion isn't just treason, it's blasphemy. That's what these numbers are doing, protecting power by stretching it beyond reason. They're not historical data, they're theological camouflage. Still, the precision is haunting. The scribes didn't just say, a very long time. They said 28,800 years. It's the difference between a fairy tale and an equation. It makes you wonder, did they really believe it? Or did they simply write what was expected, letting faith do the math? You run your fingers across the tablet and realize something else. The King List isn't confused. We are. We've forgotten how to read myth in numbers, how to see meaning without demanding measurement. To the Sumerians, time wasn't a straight line with neat beginnings and ends. It was a cycle. It turned like their irrigation wheels, like their stars, like their endless dynasties. A king didn't reign for 36,000 years because he lived that long. He reigned because his rule echoed the gods, whose time was eternal. But when you look at it now, with your modern eyes and your sense of minutes, it just looks wrong. Too big. Too absurd. It's a math problem that refuses to balance. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the numbers weren't meant to make sense, they were meant to humble sense itself. You can't leave numbers like that alone. 28,000, 36,000, 43,000. They don't just sit quietly on a tablet. They whisper. They taunt. They beg to be explained. And for thousands of years, people have tried. You can sort most explanations into three categories: the rational, the symbolic, and the please put down the crystal. Let's start with the rational. These interpreters see the King List as the world's oldest administrative spreadsheet. They argue the numbers were never meant to be literal years. Maybe they stood for months, seasons, or dynastic totals. Perhaps 36,000 years meant 36 rulers, each ruling for 1,000 days. Or maybe a scribe, lost in translation between number systems, multiplied when he should have divided. That's the comforting view. The clerical error theory. It's neat, it's tidy, and it spares you from imagining a man reigning since the Ice Age. Then there's the symbolic camp, the poets and the priests of interpretation. To them, these reigns were never about time at all. They were about scale. Numbers as metaphors. In this reading, 43,200 years isn't a statistic, it's a statement. This ruler's authority is as vast as creation itself. You can see why this theory works. The King List loves patterns. Its use of SARS and NS, multiples of 60, mirrors the structure of the heavens, the geometry of the cosmos. The Sumerians saw math as sacred language. To them, numbers didn't just count, they meant. So maybe the king list wasn't listing lifespans. Maybe it was composing a kind of cosmic poetry, a way to map divine rhythm onto human rule. Like writing, the gods breathe through kings, but with better math. And then, there's the third group. The ones who look at those same numbers and say, see? Proof. Proof that ancient aliens, lost civilizations, or advanced pre-flood societies once existed. Beings who ruled the earth before everything was wiped clean. To them, 241,200 years isn't exaggeration, it's evidence. The king list isn't myth, it's memory. A record of something we've forgotten. A golden age when humans were gods or gods were human. It's easy to scoff at that. But it's also easy to see why the theory survives. Because buried under all the speculation, there's an ache, a human longing for origins. We can't stand the idea that the past is just mud and coincidence. We want grandeur, a beginning worth remembering. And the king list delivers exactly that. A civilization so ancient, so divine, that even time itself bowed before it. You sit back and think about that, about how every interpretation, from scholar to mystic, is really trying to answer the same question. What did the Sumerians know that we don't? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. The text itself is silent. The tablets don't explain the numbers. They just list them, unbothered by their own absurdity. There's no footnote that says, by the way, don't take this literally. No scribe ever scrawled a nervous in the margin. They didn't need to justify it, because they weren't trying to convince anyone. They were recording a worldview. To the Sumerians, myth and history weren't separate genres. They were the same language, spoken in different tenses. Modern people like neat boxes, fact, fiction, legend, record. The Sumerians didn't. For them, everything was real, just on different layers of reality. A king could rule both in heaven and on earth, and it wasn't a contradiction. It was continuity. That's the part modern minds struggle with most. The idea that truth doesn't have to be literal to be true. You can almost imagine a Sumerian scribe shaking his head at us. You think 36,000 years is impossible? Of course it is. That's the point. The flood divides time, but belief flows right through it. And whether you see those numbers as cosmic symbols, clerical chaos, or extraterrestrial evidence, they all point to the same human hunger, the need to believe our story began somewhere extraordinary. Because, once upon a time, just isn't enough. We want once for 43,000 years. You've read the tablets. You've traced the numbers. You've entertained the idea of gods, aliens, and divine spreadsheets. Now it's time to get your hands dirty. Literally. Because for all the mythic grandeur of the Sumerian King List, archaeology is not impressed. The ground, blunt, patient, and unsentimental, has its own version of events. When you dig into the ruins of ancient Sumer, you don't find evidence of kings ruling for 40 millennia. You find mud brick cities, irrigation ditches, and tablets full of accounting, taxes, temple offerings, receipts for goats. You find human fingerprints pressed into clay that's still damp 5,000 years later. You find people, not immortals. The earliest levels of cities like Eridu, Uruk, and Kish date to around 5000 to 3500 BCE. That's old, unimaginably old, but not 43,000 years old. That's Ice Age territory. That's mammoths and glaciers, not beer and barley. So when archaeologists hear claims of kings ruling for 36,000 years, they sigh, brush off the dust, and quietly remind everyone that no trace of any pre-flood civilization has ever been found. No palaces. No inscriptions. No ruins older than the oldest mud brick foundations in southern Mesopotamia. And yet, there's always a whisper of doubt. Because in the dirt, between layers of ancient habitation, archaeologists do sometimes find signs of a flood, or more accurately, floods. Thick bands of river silt between city layers. Erosion lines where the Euphrates once burst its banks and reset the landscape. Not world-ending cataclysms, but devastating enough for people living in the floodplain to call it the end of everything. It's easy to see how a local disaster became a cosmic event, how a few meters of flood sediment turned into divine punishment written in clay. And it's just as easy to see how that great flood became the line between myth and memory in the King List. Still, archaeologists keep looking. Each new discovery, a fragment of tablet, a buried temple, a set of city walls, adds another layer to the story. And slowly, patterns emerge. We start to recognize names. Enmebaragesi of Kish, one of the first rulers from the King List to be confirmed archaeologically. His name appears on fragments of votive inscriptions, carved in early Sumerian cuneiform. Finally, a king who actually existed. But he didn't rule for 900 years. Probably closer to 30. Which, by ancient standards, is still impressive, just not mythological. Other names follow. Some kings blur into each other. Others vanish entirely, existing only in the tablets. The line between history and legend grows fuzzier the further back you go. And that's where archaeology becomes both liberating and frustrating. It gives you solid answers, but those answers are never quite as exciting as the myths. No god kings. No golden cities before the flood. No 36,000-year reigns. Just mud, tools, and the quiet hum of early civilization trying to survive. But maybe that's the real miracle. Not that someone ruled for 40 millennia, but that anyone ruled at all in a landscape that flooded, burned, and starved with such enthusiasm. Think about it. The King List's grand cosmic drama is, at its core, a record of humans refusing to give up, rewriting their world after every collapse, calling it divine destiny instead of recovery. Each new dynasty isn't proof of gods, it's proof of persistence. So when you compare archaeology with legend, you find a strange harmony. The myths exaggerate, the ruins confirm. The King List says, kingship descended from heaven. Archaeology says, kingship crawled out of the mud. And somehow both are true. Because maybe descending from heaven was never about gods floating down. Maybe it was about order, the idea that structure itself was a gift, a miracle in a world that constantly collapsed. That's what archaeology really shows us, not a lost age of immortals, but the birth of bureaucracy, religion, and civilization in the middle of chaos. The King List remembers the mythic why. The ruins remember the pragmatic how. And together, they whisper the same truth. Humanity has always been building meaning out of mud. It's just one sentence on the tablet. Short, calm, and almost bored in tone. The kind of line you could miss if you blink. Then the flood swept over. That's it. No description, no drama. No screaming skies or roaring waters. Just a single, flat statement, as if the entire world's erasure was a routine entry in an ancient spreadsheet. And yet that single line is the hinge of everything. It's the dividing wall between myth and history, between gods and humans, between eternity and time. Before it, 8 kings rule for 241,200 years. After it, kings are mortal, reigns are short, and the gods stay politely off stage. The flood is more than a story. It's a reset button. A cosmic control plus alt plus delete for civilization. And here's the unsettling part. The Sumerians weren't alone in telling it. From Mesopotamia to India, from Egypt to Greece, flood myths keep surfacing like driftwood. Each one begins the same way. Humanity forgets its place, the gods get irritated, and water becomes judgment. In the Sumerian version, it's the city of Shuruppak that faces the flood. There, a man named Isidra, the earliest prototype of Noah, is warned by the gods. He builds a boat. He survives. And when the waters retreat, the gods bless him and his descendants. The story ends not with destruction, but with renewal. Civilization is reborn. Kingship descends from heaven once more, and this time it lands in Kish. It's hard not to see the poetry. Every flood myth is really a story about memory, about what happens when everything you've built is washed away, and all you have left is the will to begin again. The King List's flood line marks that moment precisely. It doesn't describe the catastrophe, it acknowledges it like a trauma you don't talk about but never forget. That's why it feels so heavy despite being so brief. It's the pause between heartbeats, the silence after the gods stop speaking. You can almost imagine the scribe carving that line, pressing his stylus into clay just a little harder than usual. Then the flood swept over. He doesn't need to elaborate. Everyone in his world knew what floods did. In southern Mesopotamia, water wasn't a gentle blessing. It was a seasonal threat. The Tigris and Euphrates could turn from lifelines to weapons overnight, drowning everything they had built. You didn't need faith to believe in floods, just bad luck and rain. So when the King List speaks of the flood, it's speaking from lived experience. The mythic catastrophe and the real one blur together. The gods punish, the rivers rise, the clay remembers. And when the waters recede, time itself restarts. You can see it in how the list is structured. Before the flood, divine kings, impossible lifespans, eternal order. After the flood, mortal kings, recognizable cities, dynastic succession. It's as if the flood didn't just wash away the world, it washed away eternity. It's the moment humanity inherits time. From then on, life is measured not in SARS and NUS, but in decades, generations, and grain rations. The gods step back and history begins. But the memory of what came before doesn't vanish. It lingers, haunting, golden, unreachable. The flood becomes a metaphor for that loss. A dividing line between what once was and what must be rebuilt. And if you listen closely, there's a faint echo in that simplicity. Then the flood swept over. No panic, no emotion. Just inevitability. That's the tone of civilizations that have collapsed before and expect to collapse again. To them, the flood isn't an anomaly, it's a rhythm. That's why the King List continues right after, almost impatiently. After the flood had swept over, when kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. It's a ritual reset. The gods wipe the board, and humanity dutifully starts writing again. So you can almost smile at the irony. For all its grandeur, the flood in the King List isn't really about divine wrath. It's about bureaucracy. Even the apocalypse has to be logged properly. You open your eyes again, and everything smells like wet earth. The flood is gone, but its silence lingers. What's left is a landscape scrubbed raw, the world after the end of the world. This is Kish, a city that, according to the Sumerian King List, inherited kingship after the waters receded. The divine order of the cosmos had to start somewhere, and apparently, it chose a patch of damp river plain. Kingship descended from heaven, the tablet says again, as if to reassure you that the paperwork of creation has been properly filed. But heaven feels quieter now. The kings who follow are not gods. They die. They bleed. They lose wars. They write receipts. Still, the clay insists they rule for hundreds of years, long enough to keep the dream alive, short enough to remind everyone that immortality drowned with the flood. The first of them is Jushur, ruling 1,200 years. After him comes Kalasinabel, whose name translates roughly to, all of them were lords. Which sounds less like a name and more like a bureaucratic shrug. It's the Sumerian equivalent of, there was a lot of turnover. And maybe there was. The flood had erased everything. Cities had to be rebuilt, fields replanted, trade routes rediscovered. Civilization was now a salvage project. The King List turns this slow recovery into divine continuity. Kingship continued, therefore order continued. But if you were living through it, it probably felt less like divine destiny and more like mud, hunger, and rebuilding from scratch. Still, the illusion of order matters. It gives people something to believe in. If kingship truly descended from heaven, then everything that follows, every law, every temple, every grain ledger, has cosmic approval. No one wants to think they're just starting over because of bad weather. You can imagine the city's first walls rising again, block by block. The smell of burnt reeds. The crack of drying clay. The cautious laughter of survivors who somehow still believe the gods are watching. And somewhere in a new palace, a king sits on a throne that's still damp, declaring that his rule is blessed by heaven. Congrats, civilization is back in business. But this new world isn't the same. The pre-flood kings were mythic, these ones are administrators. They don't command the stars, they manage grain rations. They build canals, draft laborers, and keep the temples stocked with offerings. The King List, for all its divine rhetoric, quietly admits this shift. After the flood, its tone changes. The divine poetry flattens into bureaucracy. It starts reading less like scripture and more like a government archive. That's how you know history has begun, when the language of gods gives way to the language of inventory. Yet the myth still clings to the edges. When Kish eventually falls, the tablet records it without drama, simply stating, Kish was defeated, kingship was taken to Eanna. And just like that, divinity relocates. Heaven's mandate packs up and moves to Uruk, like an exhausted god changing offices. This cyclical passing of kingship, from one city to the next, becomes the heartbeat of the King List. Each fall and rise a reminder that even divine order needs new management. But underneath that rhythm, there's something deeply human, the quiet terror of impermanence. Every city that rises believes it's chosen. Every one that falls insists it was part of the plan. The flood may be gone, but its shadow remains. Because once you've seen the world wiped clean, you never really stop waiting for the next one. The scribes knew this. You can feel it in the tone of their writing, reverent but weary. As if they're saying, yes, the gods restored kingship. But don't get comfortable. And maybe that's why Kish matters so much. It isn't the first city, it's the first city after. The proof that humans can crawl out of myth and still choose to build. The flood was an ending. Kish is the first stubborn beginning. It's civilization's hangover, shaky, suspicious, but still showing up for work. And when the King List moves on, to Uruk, to Ur, to Ison, it's not just moving kings. It's carrying the memory of the flood forward, written into every reign, every collapse, every rebirth. Because once the world has ended once, every dynasty after it knows it can happen again. You might think that after the flood, civilization would settle down, learn a little humility, maybe stop angering the gods. In Sumer, the lesson of disaster was simple: rebuild, rebrand, repeat. Kingship, the King List insists, didn't stay in one place. It moved, like a divine franchise license. First Kish, then Uruk, then Ur, then An, and on it went, traveling across the dusty alluvium of southern Mesopotamia like a celestial nomad with commitment issues. The tablet records it like a sacred game of musical thrones. Kish fell. Kingship was taken to Eanna. Uruk fell. Kingship was taken to Ur. Ur fell. Kingship was taken to Awan. Each city is described as the new cradle of power, the latest place where kingship descended from heaven. The phrase repeats so often it starts to sound bureaucratic. You can almost hear a weary scribe sighing, carving another line of divine paperwork into clay. Congrats, you're living in a world where heaven has a relocation policy. But beneath that repetition, something fascinating hums. The Sumerians weren't just chronicling history. They were explaining how order survives chaos. Every time a city fell, through flood, invasion, or sheer incompetence, kingship itself didn't die. It was transferred. That idea matters. It's ancient resilience, wrapped in theology. To live in Sumer was to know instability. The rivers flooded unpredictably. Crops failed. Enemies appeared on the horizon with alarming punctuality. And yet, the King List says, order continues. Heaven still blesses someone. Somewhere, a king still wears the crown, even if your city just sank into the mud. The psychological comfort of that cannot be overstated. Because when everything feels temporary, you want to believe something eternal is still watching the ledger. Imagine standing in the ruins of Uruk. The temples cracked, the ziggurat half collapsed, the statues of gods smeared with soot. Someone, maybe you, picks up a piece of broken clay tablet and whispers, "Kingship has gone to Ur." And just like that, hope moves downriver. But there's also irony in the pattern. Each new city believes it's the one. Chosen, eternal, heaven's favorite. Until the next one comes along. Sumerian civilization is, in that sense, a loop, divine legitimacy constantly recycled, the same story told in different bricks. You can almost imagine a celestial clerk stamping approved on each new city before filing it under temporary. And what's remarkable is how calmly the King List reports all of this. No drama, no lamentations, just transitions. To the ancient mind, even collapse was part of the design. The flood taught them that endings could be divine too. So kingship migrates. From Kish to Uruk, the home of the hero Gilgamesh. Yes, that Gilgamesh, the king who later searches for immortality and fails spectacularly. It's poetic, really. The same civilization that once claimed rulers lived for 43,200 years now writes an epic about how no one lives forever. Uruk thrives for a while, a city of high walls, great temples, and bureaucratic poetry. Its kings rule for hundreds of years, which by Sumerian standards counts as average. But then, inevitably, the refrain returns. Uruk fell. Kingship was taken to Ur. And the cycle continues. To us, it reads like a historical record. To them, it was theology, proof that divine order was mobile, adaptable, even pragmatic. Heaven didn't abandon humanity after the flood, it just moved downstream. The modern mind sees that and thinks, this is political spin. The ancient mind saw continuity, the eternal rhythm of rise and fall, legitimacy and loss. You might say the Sumerians invented the first philosophy of history. Not progress, not decline, just rotation. Civilization doesn't march forward, it turns in circles, like a potter's wheel, spinning the same clay into new shapes. Every city a vessel that eventually cracks. And maybe that's the real genius of the King List. It isn't about immortality at all. It's about impermanence disguised as divine structure. A cosmic way of saying, yes, everything ends, but not everything is lost. You look up from the tablet, the cuneiform rose still glistening with the scribe's moisture. The air smells like river silt and burning oil. Somewhere, a new king in a new city is rehearsing the old words, the ones that keep the illusion alive. Kingship has descended from heaven. And for a little while longer, everyone believes it. You're sitting in front of the tablet again. It's small, brown, and covered in wedges that look like someone's idea of bird tracks. Each mark is time, or at least, someone's attempt to make sense of it. The Sumerian King List doesn't just list rulers. It measures them. And that's where the real strangeness begins. One king rules for 28,800 years. Another for 36,000. A third for 43,200. You start adding them up and before you know it, you've crossed 241,200 years, 8 kings, 5 cities, and one cosmic timeline that feels less like history and more like a math problem written by a god. You could try to rationalize it. Maybe they meant months, not years. Maybe they counted dynasties, not lifetimes. Maybe someone just really liked zeros. But then you realize, the Sumerians didn't even use zero. So what on earth were they doing? The numbers aren't random. They use SARs and NIS, Sumerian units of time. 1 SAR equals 3,600 years. 1 NI equals 600. It's a base 60 system, neat and circular, the kind that mathematicians still dream about when they look at a clock. The first king, Alyalim of Eridu, reigns 8 SARs, 28,800 years. The second, Alaugr, 10 SARs, 36,000 years. The list goes on, repeating in smooth, round multiples, as if time itself was measured by geometry, not mortality. You start to see a pattern, or maybe that's the point. Each number is divisible by 60. Each reign feels more like a cycle than a lifespan. It's not how long they ruled. It's how perfectly their time fit into the rhythm of heaven. The Sumerians lived by the stars. Their gods were planetary, their temples astronomically aligned, their calendars celestial machines of dust and mathematics. So maybe these kings didn't live for millennia, maybe they represented millennia. Each one a constellation of years, a mythic gear in the cosmic clock. That would explain the precision, why the numbers are clean, elegant, almost ritualistic. You can imagine a priest in Eridu pressing stylus into clay, murmuring, 8 SARs for Alyalim, because 8 is sacred. Or perhaps, 10 SARs for Alaugr, because that's the full circuit of the sun through the heavens. And suddenly, these kings aren't men, they're epics. Symbols of balance and order, the ages before everything fell apart. A golden time when divine rule still had perfect symmetry. Of course, later scribes might have misunderstood that. Or maybe they didn't care. It's easy to let numbers drift from symbolism into absurdity when you're copying tablets by firelight for the 1000th time. By the time archaeologists uncover the fragments thousands of years later, it reads like an ancient joke. 8 kings ruled for 241,200 years. Sure they did. But there's something strangely satisfying about it. A civilization old enough to play with time. To stretch it, bend it, sculpt it into myth. Today we complain when a government lasts more than 2 election cycles. In Sumer, that was barely a fraction of 1 Sar. There's a dark humor in it too. The Sumerians knew decay. Their temples eroded. Their fields failed. Their rivers turned to salt. And yet they wrote reigns longer than ice ages. It's the kind of optimism that borders on delusion or faith. You wonder if they believed it literally. Did anyone truly think Al-Yalim sat on a throne for 28,800 years, watching generations die like flies? Maybe. Or maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe it was about saying, before the flood, before chaos, there was order so perfect it lasted forever. That's what the numbers do. They freeze time. They turn divine authority into arithmetic. And when the flood comes, that divine audit that wipes it all clean, the numbers stop being history and become myth. It's tempting to look at those figures and laugh. But part of you, deep down, understands. Because we still do the same thing. We give numbers to our myths. 7 days of creation. 12 apostles. 9 circles of hell. We turn eternity into something we can count. The Sumerians just happen to be more ambitious. You glance again at the King List. Those wedges of clay, pressed by hands that believed they were recording the shape of time. And maybe they were. Because whether or not those kings ever lived, their numbers did. And numbers, unlike empires, don't die. You look at the King List and wonder, did anyone truly believe this? That's the uncomfortable question lurking behind every wedge of cuneiform, whether the ancient scribes were historians, storytellers, or something in between. In truth, they were probably both. The Sumerians didn't separate history from myth the way we do. For them, the past wasn't just what happened, it was what mattered. And what mattered most was kingship, who had it, who lost it, and which God approved the transfer. So the King List isn't a neutral record. It's a political spell. It tells a story where divine legitimacy flows like a river, steady, sacred, and conveniently ending in whichever city the scribe happened to live in. You can almost see him, a tired man with a reed stylus, hunched over wet clay, mumbling under his breath. Kingship began in Eridu, yes. Then Bad Tibra, Zimbir, Shirapet, right, the flood, and then Kish, of course, because my patron god says so. Each version of the King List that archaeologists find differs slightly. Reigns adjusted, names rearranged, divine priorities subtly edited. It's like a remix of cosmic authority, customized for local audiences. And that tells you something important. The King List isn't about accuracy. It's about continuity. When the Sumerians looked back, they didn't see prehistory. They saw memory, distorted but sacred. The flood wasn't a metaphor, it was an event that left the world different. The antediluvian kings weren't fantasy, they were the divine age that made the human one possible. In a sense, the King List was their way of remembering the unimaginable. After all, how do you preserve a story older than cities? You anchor it to names, to numbers, to clay. You give the chaos a lineage. And by doing so, you turn trauma into theology. The flood might have been real, a massive inundation, a natural disaster encoded into myth. The long rains might reflect a prehistorical dream time, a period when the line between gods and humans hadn't yet hardened. Or maybe it's just poetic math, a way to say, once upon a time, the world was different. And yet, something in the King List feels like memory. The calm repetition, the cyclical logic, the insistence that kingship always survives. That's not fantasy, that's hope, fossilized in clay. Think about it. You live in a land where the rivers can erase entire cities overnight. Every generation sees ruins older than itself. The ground itself is a graveyard of former greatness. Wouldn't you want to believe there was a plan? That the gods hadn't just abandoned you, but were still moving pieces on some divine chessboard? That every fall of a city wasn't chaos, it was destiny? That's what the King List does. It gives disaster a pattern. It turns the endless uncertainty of Mesopotamian life into a sequence that makes sense. Of course, we look at it now and call it myth. We smile at the numbers, the divine bureaucracy, the casual 1,000-year reigns. But that's because we have the luxury of distance. To the Sumerians, these weren't fairy tales. They were blueprints for survival, stories that told you why the world kept breaking and why it was worth rebuilding anyway. And maybe that's why the list survived for thousands of years, copied and recopied, even into Babylonian times. Because every civilization that followed needed the same reassurance. That power is eternal, that collapse is temporary, and that kingship, whatever that really means, never dies. The King List isn't trying to tell you who ruled when. It's whispering something else. That human order, however fragile, is part of a divine rhythm. It's myth wearing the mask of record-keeping. A bedtime story for bureaucrats, told in the language of clay. And if you listen closely, beneath the hum of divine legitimacy and cosmic cycles, you can still hear the oldest human voice of all. The one that says, "We were here. We mattered. Remember us." You stand again on the plain, the Tigris to one side, the Euphrates to the other, and imagine water stretching to the horizon. No cities. No walls. Just the surface of the flood, silent and endless, like the gods hit, reset, and went to bed. That's where the King List draws its first line. Then the flood swept over. No poetry. No details. Just that one calm sentence dividing everything into before and after. And maybe that's exactly how it felt. Because to the Sumerians, floods weren't metaphors. They were facts. The rivers were both life and death. Gentle one month, murderous the next. When the rains came too hard, the whole world could vanish overnight. It's easy to see why a story grew around it. When disaster is that absolute, you don't just rebuild your house, you rebuild your meaning. So they did. The flood in Sumer wasn't just about water, it was about judgment. A moment when the gods, annoyed with humanity's noise or arrogance, decided to start over. It's an ancient theme that echoes later. In Genesis, in Gilgamesh, in every culture that remembers nearly drowning. But here, on the King List, it's not told as a story, it's treated like an administrative note. The line between the divine and the bureaucratic has never been thinner. Then the flood swept over. Next line. Kingship descended from heaven to Kish. You have to admire the efficiency. Even after divine annihilation, someone had to keep the paperwork moving. There's something both tragic and funny about that. The world ends, but the hierarchy resumes. The gods drown humanity, but the crown still floats. You can almost imagine the surviving scribe, hair caked with river mud, carving the words with a shaky stylus. Yes, everything was destroyed. Anyway, next dynasty. But behind that dry tone lies the oldest human impulse, the need to explain why bad things happen. The Sumerians didn't think in terms of random chance. If catastrophe struck, someone, mortal or divine, must have deserved it. So the flood becomes a moral boundary. Before it, divine kings who ruled impossibly long ages. After it, human kings, shorter lives, fragile power. A cosmic demotion. The gods let humans live, but they took away eternity. That's why the reigns shrink from tens of thousands of years to hundreds. It's not an error, it's theology. The flood didn't just wash away cities, it washed away immortality. From now on, kings die. History begins. That's the quiet heartbreak written into the clay, the sense that something perfect was lost. The pre-flood world might be myth, but it's also nostalgia. A longing for a time when the divine and human weren't separated by death. You can feel it echoing in later stories. Adam and Eve cast out, gods abandoning Olympus, paradise always one mistake ago. The Sumerians wrote the first version of that loss. But the flood also gave them something else, continuity. It's the reason the King List doesn't end there. Because if the flood was the end of everything, there would be no one left to write about it. So the story insists on survivors, the ones who rebuild, who remember, who record, the ones who take the chaos and shape it into chronology. Every line after the flood is an act of defiance, a promise that order will rise again even from the mud. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in the clay. Not that gods are cruel, not that humans are foolish, but that the cycle never truly breaks. Floods come, cities fall, kingship moves, and still, someone writes it down. You can imagine the last light of a Sumerian evening, a scribe squinting by an oil lamp, pressing each wedge into soft clay. Outside, the river gurgles, patient, eternal, waiting. It knows it will return one day. It always does. The Sumerians understood that. That's why they wrote their apocalypse into the fabric of their history, not as an end, but as a warning label for civilization itself. All this has happened before. And if you listen closely, beneath the hiss of the reeds and the crackle of drying clay, you can still hear what the flood was really saying. Not, you will die. But don't forget. You're back where it began, staring at a cracked tablet in a glass case. The museum light hums quietly. The wedge marks are faint now, like the heartbeat of a civilization that refuses to stop. 8 kings. 241,200 years. A flood that wiped it all clean. And still, someone wrote it down. That's the part that stays with you. Because the Sumerian King List isn't just about rulers or numbers. It's about the human obsession with continuity. The desperate need to say, we mattered. Even when the world keeps proving otherwise. It's easy to dismiss it now, to call it myth, propaganda, or creative accounting. But deep down, you recognize the impulse. We do the same thing, just with different tools. We build databases, timelines, family trees. We list presidents, popes, dynasties, empires. We write world histories, as if the universe is patiently waiting for our citations. And like the Sumerians, we keep pretending time is something we can organize. Neatly. Logically. Comfortably. Spoiler alert, it isn't. Time leaks. It collapses and doubles back. It buries things. It forgets most of what we are. The Sumerians knew that better than anyone. They lived in a land that erased itself every season. Cities literally melted back into the soil. And so they invented memory, hard, tangible, baked into clay. The King List is their way of saying, we will not vanish. Even if we have to turn eternity into math to make it believable. And that's what makes it strangely beautiful. Because behind all the divine rhetoric, the absurdly long rains, the calm after the flood, there's something achingly human. A quiet voice under all that cosmic formality saying, we're trying to understand why everything ends. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the King List isn't lying. Maybe it's just speaking the only language that could make sense of loss. Numbers, names, rhythm. The list doesn't ask you to believe. It asks you to remember. To feel what it's like to live at the edge of memory, to watch the divine fade into the mortal, and to keep writing anyway. You picture that last scribe again. A bent figure in lamplight, clay tablet cooling beside him. He's copying from an older version, maybe half destroyed. The flood is long past. But in his mind, the water never stopped rising. And yet, he keeps pressing the stylus. Each mark a refusal. Each word an act of faith in the permanence of impermanence. Maybe he knows no one will remember the kings. Maybe he knows the list itself will sink into the dirt one day. But he also knows something larger, that writing outlasts living. That myth is a kind of survival. When you step back from the case, you realize how little separates you from him. You both stare at the past, trying to make sense of it before it's gone. You both live in civilizations that think they'll last forever. You both know they won't. The flood is coming for everyone. It just changes shape. For him it was water. For you it's time. Same difference. And when it arrives, maybe you'll do what he did. Tell a story. Carve a name. Write it down even when you know it won't last. Because that's all the King List really is. A long, tired promise that history, however distorted, We'll keep whispering to whoever comes next. We were here. We ruled. We dreamed. We drowned. And still, we remembered.